The grand hall of the luxury hotel brimmed with soft golden light, a reflection of the elaborate chandeliers dangling from the ceiling. The hum of polite conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter, drifted through the air like the melody of a well-composed symphony. Park Hyun-jae, the renowned CEO of HJ Group, stood near the bar, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him with sharp precision. He exuded an aura of authority and arrogance, his dark, piercing eyes scanning the room like a hawk seeking its prey. Hyun-jae's face was a mask of calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a silent protest against being dragged to yet another corporate networking event. He hated the predictability of these gatherings, the insincere flattery, the shallow exchanges. But tonight, there was one unpredictability: Kang Eun-woo. Eun-woo, his oldest friend and occasional thorn in his side, approached him with a mischievous grin. "You look bored, Hyun-jae," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Shouldn't the king of the corporate world be enjoying his own court?" Hyun-jae raised an eyebrow, sipping his whiskey. "Unlike you, Eun-woo, I'm not here to entertain myself. Business first." Eun-woo chuckled, his tone turning teasing. "Then let me make this evening interesting for you. A little challenge, perhaps?" Hyun-jae sighed. He knew Eun-woo too well. His challenges were always reckless. "I'm not interested in your games. But this one will test that sharp mind of yours," Eun-woo pressed, leaning closer. His voice dropped, inviting intrigue. "See that girl over there?" Hyun-jae followed Eun-woo's gaze to the far side of the room. A young woman stood quietly by the corner, her presence so understated it was easy to overlook her amidst the glittering crowd. She wore a simple uniform, a janitor's attire, and held a mop in her hands. Her dark hair was tied back, revealing a pale, heart-shaped face with delicate features. Despite her modest appearance, there was something striking about her. Her eyes, large and expressive, seemed to hold secrets, a quiet defiance. Ji-soo, Eun-woo continued. "She's one of your employees, isn't she? A janitor." Hyun-jae's expression tightened. "And your point is?" "I bet you wouldn't last a month married to someone like her," Eun-woo said, his tone casual but laced with challenge. "She's mute, you know. Doesn't speak a word. Think of it, Park Hyun-jae, the ice-cold CEO, tied down to someone like her. It would be the headline of the century." Hyun-jae's eyes narrowed, his pride prickling at the suggestion. He knew Eun-woo's intentions were to provoke, to entertain himself by making Hyun-jae squirm. But something about Eun-woo's smirk, so smug, so certain of Hyun-jae's refusal, made him pause. "1 month?" Hyun-jae asked, his tone as sharp as the edge of a knife. Eun-woo raised his eyebrows, surprised. "1 month. I bet you can't handle it." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Hyun-jae's face. "Fine. You've got yourself a bet." Eun-woo clapped his hands, laughing. "This is going to be fun." Hours later, as Hyun-jae sat in the back seat of his sleek black car, the reality of his impulsive decision began to settle. He tapped his fingers against his thigh, his thoughts racing. Why had he agreed to such a ridiculous bet? Perhaps it was his pride, wounded by Eun-woo's mocking tone. Or perhaps it was something else, the quiet challenge in Ji-soo's eyes as she looked up from her work earlier, sensing the weight of his gaze on her. But no matter. He was Park Hyun-jae after all. Whatever came next, he would handle it with the same control and precision he applied to everything else in his life. Far from the glittering halls of the hotel, Ji-soo walked home through the quiet streets of Seoul, her steps light but purposeful. Her lips curved slightly, though she made no sound. Her thoughts were her own, and she liked it that way. The marriage was a quiet, impersonal affair. There were no flowers, no vows exchanged under a sunlit canopy, no gathered family members to bear witness. Instead, Park Hyun-jae and Ji-soo stood side by side in the cold, unfeeling confines of a government registry office. The room was sterile, the walls a dull gray, and the only sounds were the mechanical clicks of a clock on the wall and the low hum of an overworked air conditioner. Hyun-jae barely spared Ji-soo a glance as they stood in front of the efficient. He had spent the car ride over convincing himself this was nothing more than an inconvenient formality, a checkmate move in a game of pride. Dressed in a sharp black suit, he exuded authority, but there was an unmistakable tension in the line of his jaw. Ji-soo, in contrast, was an enigma of calm. She wore a simple white blouse and a modest skirt, her dark hair pulled neatly into a ponytail. Despite the plainness of her attire, there was an elegance to her, something unassuming yet magnetic. Her gaze was steady, her silence unbroken. "Do you, Park Hyun-jae, take Lee Ji-soo as your lawful wife?" the officiant asked, his voice monotone. Hyun-jae's answer came swiftly, without hesitation. "Yes? And do you, Lee Ji-soo, take Park Hyun-jae as your lawful husband?" Ji-soo's response was a nod, her eyes briefly meeting Hyun-jae's. In that fleeting moment, something flickered in her gaze. Defiance? Curiosity? It was hard to say. With the signing of their names, it was done. No applause, no smiles, no congratulations. Just the sharp scratch of pens against paper and the faint shuffle of the officiant filing away their certificates. The car ride back to Hyun-jae's mansion was steeped in silence, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. Ji-soo sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, gazing out of the window as the towering skyline of Seoul gave way to quieter, wealthier suburbs. Hyun-jae stole a glance at her from the corner of his eye. She was so composed, so unfazed by the situation. Her silence was unnerving, and for the first time, he wondered if Yoonwoo had chosen her for more than just her job title. "You'll have your own room," Hyun-jae said abruptly. His tone clipped. It was the first thing he'd said to her since leaving the registry office. "This arrangement is temporary. 1 month. Don't forget that." Ji-soo turned her head toward him, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded, a small, deliberate movement that seemed to unsettle him further. The mansion loomed before them, an imposing structure of glass and steel nestled behind high gates. It was immaculate, modern, and cold, just like its owner. Ji-soo stepped out of the car, her gaze sweeping over the vastness of the property. She didn't betray any emotion, though the faintest tilt of her head suggested curiosity. Hyun-jae led her through the grand double doors into a cavernous foyer. The polished marble floors gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier. Every surface was pristine, every piece of furniture perfectly positioned, yet the space felt more like a museum than a home. A housekeeper approached, bowing deeply. "Welcome, madam," she said softly, her eyes darting nervously between Ji-soo and Hyun-jae. Ji-soo offered a polite bow in return, though she said nothing. Hyun-jae dismissed the housekeeper with a curt nod, then turned to Ji-soo. "This is where you'll be staying," he said, gesturing toward the stairs. "Your room is on the left. Do not go into my study or my personal quarters." His tone left no room for argument. Ji-soo nodded again, her composure unshaken. Her silence infuriated him, though he couldn't quite explain why. That night, Hyun-jae found himself in his study, staring at a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, the indifferent way Ji-soo had nodded at their wedding, her quiet acceptance of his rules. It was as if she was toying with him without uttering a single word. Meanwhile, in the quiet of her new room, Ji-soo sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting lightly on her knees. She gazed at the night sky through the large window, the distant city lights twinkling like scattered diamonds. A faint smile played on her lips, though her eyes held a shadow of something far deeper. Neither of them slept well that night. Morning broke over the mansion, the pale winter sunlight streaming through the glass walls. Park Hyun-jae sat at the sleek dining table in the sprawling kitchen, sipping his black coffee. The rich aroma filled the air, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying his interactions with Ji-soo the day before. She was quiet. Too quiet. For someone thrust into a life so vastly different from her own, she displayed no shock, no hesitation. The silence was shattered by the faint sound of footsteps. Ji-soo appeared in the doorway, her simple blouse and skirt a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of her surroundings. She moved with quiet confidence, her gaze scanning the room before landing on him. "Good morning," he said curtly, unsure why he bothered. He wasn't expecting a response, and true to form, Ji-soo only nodded in acknowledgement before taking a seat at the far end of the table. The housekeeper brought her a tray of breakfast, perfectly arranged fruit, toast, and tea. Ji-soo accepted it with a small bow of thanks, but didn't touch the food immediately. Instead, she sat, her posture straight, her movements precise, almost calculated. Hyun-jae found himself studying her again, an unspoken question gnawing at him. What was she thinking? Later that day, Ji-soo began exploring the mansion. She moved through the vast halls with quiet curiosity, her footsteps light against the polished marble floors. Each room was a testament to wealth. Artwork adorned the walls, designer furniture filled the spaces. But it all felt impersonal, like a model home rather than a place where someone truly lived. She paused in front of a grand piano stationed in a sunlit corner of the main living room. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might play. But then she pulled back, her gaze shifting toward the window, where the garden stretched out in pristine symmetry. Unbeknownst to her, Hyun-jae had entered the room, his presence unnoticed. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her. The way she moved, the way she looked at things, it was deliberate, as if she were cataloging every detail. "You don't have to act like a guest," he said, his voice startling her slightly. "This is your home now for the time being." Ji-soo turned to face him, her expression neutral. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. Not a submissive gesture, but one that seemed almost amused. The faintest glimmer of a smile touched her lips before she turned back toward the window, leaving him standing there, unnerved. That evening, Hyun-jae attended a video conference in his study. The meeting was uneventful, but his focus wavered, his thoughts drifting to Ji-soo. He didn't understand her, and that lack of understanding was unsettling. She was a puzzle, and Hyun-jae wasn't accustomed to puzzles he couldn't solve. Meanwhile, Ji-soo found herself in the kitchen, tidying up after dinner. The housekeeper had offered to do it, but Ji-soo insisted with a simple gesture. Alone in the quiet space, she moved with practiced efficiency, the mundane task bringing a sense of familiarity. As she wiped down the counters, her hand brushed against an envelope tucked near the edge of the kitchen island. She froze. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but its placement was deliberate. Ji-soo glanced over her shoulder, her expression tightening. Carefully, she slipped the envelope into her pocket and continued cleaning, her movements now slightly more hurried. Hyun-jae emerged from his study an hour later, the tension of work still clinging to him. He found Ji-soo sitting in the living room, her figure framed by the warm glow of the fireplace. She was reading a book, its cover unassuming, and didn't look up as he approached. "You don't talk much, do you?" he asked, his tone laced with faint irritation. Ji-soo lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes with calm defiance. Then she tilted her head slightly as if to say, "What would you like me to say?" Hyun-jae chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "This is going to be a long month." Ji-soo didn't react, but her lips curved ever so slightly, a subtle smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. That night, Ji-soo returned to her room and locked the door behind her. She pulled out the envelope she had found earlier and opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper, the handwriting unfamiliar but precise. The note read, "Remember why you're here. Don't forget what's at stake." Ji-soo stared at the words, her face unreadable. Slowly, She folded the note and slipped it back into the envelope, placing it in the drawer of her nightstand. She turned off the light and lay on the bed, her eyes open, her mind churning. In his own room, Hyun-jae stood by the window, staring out into the night. For the first time in years, he felt like his carefully ordered life was slipping out of his control, and the source of the disturbance was a woman who hadn't spoken a single word to him. The days at the mansion settled into a routine, albeit an unusual one. Ji-soo moved through the space like a shadow, quiet, but never unnoticed. Each morning she appeared in the dining room at the same time, her actions deliberate and graceful. She had taken to small, unobtrusive tasks around the house, adjusting a crooked frame, watering plants left untouched by the housekeeper, organizing small items left out of place. Hyun-jae observed these details from a distance. For someone who barely spoke, Ji-soo's presence was curiously loud, and it gnawed at him. She wasn't an invader, but she wasn't a guest either. She existed in an odd limbo that Hyun-jae couldn't categorize, and it frustrated him. It was on the third morning of this new routine that Hyun-jae's tightly controlled world was forced to shift. He sat at the head of the dining table, his usual coffee steaming in front of him, when a sudden dizziness hit him. His vision blurred, and he felt the room spin. He tried to rise but stumbled, catching himself against the edge of the table. His coffee cup shattered on the floor, the sound breaking the silence. Ji-soo, who had just entered the room, froze for a moment before rushing to his side. Hyun-jae waved her off weakly, his pride forcing him to deny the help he clearly needed. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him with its weakness. Ji-soo ignored his protest, slipping an arm under his to steady him. Though slight in frame, she moved with surprising strength and efficiency, guiding him to the nearest couch. Hyun-jae, too disoriented to resist, allowed himself to be seated, his breathing shallow. Ji-soo disappeared momentarily and returned with a glass of water and a cool cloth. She pressed the cloth gently to his forehead, her movements steady and precise. For the first time, Hyun-jae noticed how close she was, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender from her skin, close enough to see the subtle determination in her eyes. "You're annoyingly persistent," he said hoarsely, managing a faint smirk despite his condition. Ji-soo didn't respond, of course. Instead, she set the glass of water on the table beside him and gestured for him to drink. Her expression, though calm, was firm. She wasn't taking no for an answer. By the time Hyun-jae recovered later that afternoon, Ji-soo had returned to her usual tasks, as if nothing had happened. But for him, something had shifted. Her quiet care had unsettled him in ways he didn't fully understand. That evening, as Hyun-jae sat in his study reviewing documents, his mind kept wandering. He remembered her touch, light but resolute, the way her presence filled the room without words. It was maddening. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said curtly, expecting his housekeeper. Instead, it was Ji-soo. She stood in the doorway, holding a tray with tea and what looked like a bowl of soup. "You don't have to keep hovering over me," Hyun-jae said, though his tone lacked its usual bite. "I told you, I'm fine." Ji-soo raised an eyebrow, her expression somewhere between amusement and defiance. She stepped into the room, placed the tray on his desk, and then gave him a pointed look that said, "Eat." He sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You're impossible," he muttered, though he reached for the soup. As he ate, he couldn't help but notice Ji-soo's eyes scanning the room. Her gaze lingered on the bookshelves, the ornate desk, and finally, on a photo frame tucked in the corner. It held a picture of a younger Hyun-jae with a man who looked strikingly similar to him. Ji-soo's expression flickered, but she quickly masked it, retreating a step. "You're curious about something," Hyun-jae observed, setting down the spoon. "Why don't you just ask?" Ji-soo's lips twitched, as if to smile. but she only shook her head lightly before bowing and leaving the room. Later that night, Hyun-jae found himself standing outside Ji-soo's room, unsure why he was there. He raised his hand to knock but stopped short. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap he saw her sitting by the window, a notebook open on her lap. She was writing, her pen moving swiftly across the page. Her face was illuminated by the soft glow of a bedside lamp, her expression focused. Hyun-jae watched for a moment, a strange sense of guilt washing over him for intruding. But before he could leave, Ji-soo turned her head, catching his gaze. Their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to still. Ji-soo didn't look surprised or embarrassed. Instead, she held his gaze with the same calm intensity that always seemed to unnerve him. Hyun-jae cleared his throat and stepped back. "Good night," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Ji-soo gave a small nod before closing the notebook and extinguishing the lamp. As Hyun-jae returned to his room, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ji-soo's silence wasn't the absence of words, but a deliberate choice. And the more he tried to understand her, the more he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. The days blurred into one another, but the tension in the mansion sharpened with each passing hour. Park Hyun-jae's focus on work, once unshakable, was now splintered. His thoughts, annoyingly, drifted to Ji-soo far more than he liked to admit. There was something about her, the way she moved silently through his world, yet managed to make it feel less cold, less sterile. That evening, Hyun-jae received an invitation to an important corporate event, a dinner attended by the elite of Seoul's business world. His first instinct was to decline. He despised these gatherings. But then, his eyes fell on Ji-soo as she quietly organized files on a shelf in the study. He cleared his throat. "You'll attend the dinner with me tomorrow." Ji-soo paused, her hand hovering over a folder. She turned to him, her expression questioning but calm. "You're my wife, remember?" he added, as if to justify the request. "It's expected." Ji-soo blinked, processing his words, then gave a single nod before returning to her task. Her reaction was maddeningly neutral, as always, but Hyun-jae couldn't help noticing a faint spark of curiosity in her eyes. The night of the event arrived, and Hyun-jae waited at the base of the grand staircase, adjusting the cuff of his suit jacket. He hadn't seen Ji-soo all evening, and he wondered briefly if she'd changed her mind about coming. His unspoken question was answered when she appeared at the top of the stairs. For a moment, the room seemed to dim, as though she'd drawn all the light to herself. Ji-soo wore a simple yet elegant black dress that hugged her frame modestly but flatteringly. Her hair was styled in soft waves, framing her delicate features. Hyun-jae stared, unable to mask his surprise. Ji-soo descended the stairs with a quiet grace, her heels clicking softly against the marble. When she reached him, he cleared his throat, trying to recover. "You clean up well," he said, his voice gruff. Ji-soo's lips quirked upward in the faintest hint of a smile before she extended her hand toward the door, as if to say, "Shall we?" The dinner was held at an exclusive hotel ballroom, its opulence rivaling that of Hyun-jae's mansion. Chandeliers cast warm light over the gathering, and the hum of conversation mingled with the soft strains of a string quartet. Ji-soo stayed by Hyun-jae's side as he greeted various business associates, her silence a sharp contrast to the chatter around them. Yet her presence was far from overlooked. Heads turned as she passed, whispers following in her wake. "Park Hyun-jae, you've certainly surprised us," one man said, his tone tinged with mockery. "Your wife is quite the contrast to your usual preferences." Hyun-jae's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Ji-soo stepped forward. She met the man's gaze steadily, her expression calm but commanding. Without uttering a word, she conveyed a quiet dignity that left the man flustered and searching for something else to say. Hyun-jae smirked, satisfied. "She speaks volumes, doesn't she?" he said coolly, steering Ji-soo away. As the evening wore on, Ji-soo's presence began to unsettle more than just Hyun-jae's business rivals. Kang Yoon-woo appeared, his ever-present smirk widening when he spotted the pair. "Hyun-jae and Ji-soo," he said, his tone dripping with amusement. "You're turning into quite the power couple." Ji-soo gave Yoon-woo a brief glance before looking away, but Hyun-jae noticed the stiffness in her posture. It was the first time he'd seen her unsettled. "You seem nervous, Ji-soo," Yoon-woo continued, his smile turning sharp. "Don't worry, I won't spill any secrets. Yet." Hyun-jae's gaze snapped to his friend. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," Yoon-woo said, raising his hands in mock innocence. "I'm just saying, everyone has their mysteries, don't they?" The car ride back to the mansion was silent, but the air between Hyun-jae and Ji-soo crackled with unspoken tension. He wanted to demand answers, to ask why Yoon-woo's words had affected her so visibly, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he broke the silence with a softer question. "Did you enjoy the evening?" Ji-soo turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she nodded. Her answer, though simple, disarmed him. It wasn't much, but it felt like a bridge. A small step toward something more. That night, Ji-soo returned to her room and closed the door, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out a folded piece of paper from her pocket. It was the same note from before, now worn from being opened and read too many times. "Remember why you're here. Don't forget what's at stake." Her eyes lingered on the words, and for the first time, her calm facade cracked. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and her shoulders sagged under the weight of the secret she carried. Meanwhile, Hyun-jae sat in his study, staring at a photo of himself and Yoon-woo from years ago. His mind churned with suspicion, but deeper than that was the nagging thought that Ji-soo wasn't just a pawn in a game he'd started. She was becoming something more, something he couldn't quite define. The unease between Park Hyun-jae and Lee Ji-soo grew, filling the silent spaces of the mansion like an invisible fog. The night after the corporate dinner, Hyun-jae sat in his study, unable to concentrate on the contracts and reports spread across his desk. His thoughts drifted repeatedly to Ji-soo and the strange tension that had hung over her ever since Yoon-woo's cryptic remarks. Who was she, really? Hyun-jae sighed, leaning back in his chair. He glanced toward the small drawer in his desk, the one where he'd placed the documents Yoon-woo had given him weeks ago. He hesitated, but curiosity won. Sliding the drawer open, he pulled out the folder and flipped through its contents. An employee profile of Ji-soo. Her history was painfully sparse. An orphan, no immediate family, and a spotty work record that included a handful of low-paying jobs before joining his company. Nothing about her screamed suspicion, yet there was a nagging sense of something missing, something deliberately hidden. A knock at the door broke his concentration. Ji-soo stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the dim light from the hallway. She gestured toward the tray of tea and snacks in her hands, silently asking permission to enter. "Come in," Hyun-jae said, his voice carrying more curiosity than command. Ji-soo set the tray down carefully on the corner of his desk. As she moved to leave, her gaze flickered briefly toward the folder, and Hyun-jae caught the slightest falter in her step. "You've seen this before," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Ji-soo froze but didn't turn around. Her shoulders stiffened, her head dipping slightly. "You know what's in here," he pressed, rising from his chair. "And you've been avoiding telling me why it matters." Still, Ji-soo said nothing. Hyun-jae's frustration bubbled over, and he stepped closer, his voice hardening. "You think you can keep playing this game, Ji-soo? Do you think your silence protects you?" She turned to face him, her eyes flashing with something unreadable. Defiance, perhaps, or fear. Then she did something unexpected. She reached out and grabbed the folder, holding it tightly against her chest. Hyun-jae stared at her, stunned. "What are you hiding?" Ji-soo shook her head, her lips pressed together in a thin line. She turned and walked briskly out of the study, leaving Hyun-jae standing there, his anger mingling with confusion. The next evening, unable to shake his growing doubts, Hyun-jae decided to follow Ji-soo. It wasn't difficult. She kept to a predictable routine, usually retreating to the library or the garden after dinner. But tonight, she moved with more purpose, her steps quick and deliberate. She slipped out of the mansion through the side gate, heading toward the nearby park. Hyun-jae trailed her at a safe distance, his long strides keeping pace as she moved through the quiet streets of the upscale neighborhood. When she reached the park, Ji-soo stopped beneath a cluster of trees, her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of a street lamp. Hyun-jae ducked behind a nearby bench, watching as a man emerged from the shadows. It was Yoo Min-seok. Hyun-jae's jaw clenched, his hands balling into fists. He couldn't hear their conversation, but the tension between Ji-soo and Min-seok was palpable. Ji-soo handed him an envelope, and Min-seok's expression turned smug as he pocketed it. Suddenly, Min-seok grabbed Ji-soo's wrist, pulling her closer. Hyun-jae was on his feet before he realized it, striding toward them with fire in his eyes. "Let her go," Hyun-jae barked, his voice cutting through the stillness of the park. Min-seok turned, his smirk deepening. "Ah, Park Hyun-jae. Always so dramatic." Ji-soo yanked her arm free and stepped between them, her hands raised as if to stop an impending fight. Her eyes pleaded with Hyun-jae, but he wasn't about to back down. "What's going on here?" Hyun-jae demanded, his gaze locked on Ji-soo. "What are you doing with him?" Ji-soo didn't answer, but her expression said everything. Fear, regret, and something that looked dangerously like guilt. Min-seok chuckled, his tone dripping with malice. "Maybe you should ask your lovely wife about her little secrets. I'm sure she has plenty to share." Back at the mansion, the silence was deafening. Ji-soo retreated to her room without a word, and Hyun-jae stood in the foyer, his mind racing. He wasn't just frustrated, he was hurt. For the first time, he realized he wanted to trust Ji-soo, but her silence made it impossible. In her room, Ji-soo sat on the edge of the bed, her head in her hands. The envelope was gone, but its weight lingered like a ghost in her mind. She knew that tonight's events had only made things worse, and the wall between her and Hyun-jae had grown higher. Neither of them slept that night. The air between Park Hyun-jae and Lee Ji-soo was thick with tension the following morning. Ji-soo's silence, once a curious enigma, now felt like a barricade, an impenetrable wall that frustrated Hyun-jae to no end. He sat in the dining room, staring at his untouched coffee, his thoughts circling the previous night's encounter like a predator stalking its prey. Across the table, Ji-soo quietly sipped her tea, her movements as graceful and unassuming as ever. She didn't meet his gaze, though she must have felt its weight. Hyun-jae slammed his cup down, the sharp clink of porcelain against marble breaking the silence. "We need to talk." Ji-soo's hand paused mid-air, the cup trembling slightly before she set it down. She looked up at him, her eyes calm but wary. "Who is Yoo Min-seok to you?" Hyun-jae demanded, his voice low but cutting. "And what was in that envelope you gave him?" Ji-soo didn't flinch, but she didn't answer either. Instead, she pushed back her chair and began to stand, as though retreating from the confrontation. "No." Hyun-jae stood as well, blocking her path. "You're not walking away from this. Not this time." Ji-soo glared at him, a rare spark of anger flashing in her eyes. She gestured sharply, her hands moving with an urgency that spoke volumes even without words. "You want me to guess?" Hyun-jae scoffed. "Fine, I'll guess. He's blackmailing you, isn't he? That's why you keep sneaking around. That's why you gave him that envelope." Ji-soo froze, her eyes widening slightly. It was a small reaction, but it was enough. "I knew it." Hyun-jae's tone was triumphant, but there was an undercurrent of hurt beneath the surface. "Why didn't you tell me? Do you not trust me, Ji-soo?" Her expression softened for a moment, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. But then, She shook her head and stepped back, her hands trembling. Hyun-jae took a deep breath, his voice lowering. "I'm trying to help you. Can't you see that?" For a moment, it seemed like she might answer him, that the walls she'd built so carefully might finally crack. But then she turned and walked away, leaving Hyun-jae standing alone in the quiet, his chest tight with frustration and something far more painful, disappointment. That evening, Ji-soo stood in the garden, the cool breeze ruffling her hair. She stared up at the darkening sky, the faint glow of the city lights reflecting in her eyes. Her mind raced, torn between the weight of her secrets and the growing pull she felt toward Hyun-jae. She had always believed that silence was her armor, her way of surviving in a world that demanded too much. But now, her silence was a prison, and it was beginning to suffocate her. "Ji-soo." Hyun-jae's voice startled her, and she turned to see him standing at the edge of the garden. His expression was different this time, less angry, more vulnerable. "Please," he said softly, stepping closer. "Just tell me the truth." For a long moment, Ji-soo didn't move. Then, as though something inside her had finally snapped, she spoke. "I was a witness." The sound of her voice, soft, trembling, but clear, hit Hyun-jae like a tidal wave. He stared at her, stunned, the weight of her words taking a moment to sink in. "What?" he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Ji-soo took a deep breath, her hands clenched at her sides. 3 years ago, Yoo Min-sok was involved in a corporate fraud scheme. I worked as a cleaner at one of the offices he used. I saw something I shouldn't have. Hyun-jae's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of her story. "And he's been blackmailing you ever since?" She nodded. "If I talk, he'll ruin me. And now..." Her voice broke slightly, but she forced herself to continue. "Now he's using me to get to you." Hyun-jae's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. "So that's why you married me, to protect yourself from him?" "No." Ji-soo's voice was firm, and she stepped closer, meeting his gaze. "I didn't have a choice about the marriage, but staying, that was my choice." The sincerity in her words hit Hyun-jae like a punch to the gut. He wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed, but all he could see was the pain in her eyes and the strength it had taken for her to finally speak. The night deepened, and the garden grew colder, but neither of them moved. Hyun-jae stared at Ji-soo, the woman who had turned his carefully controlled life upside down. "You should have told me sooner," he said quietly, his voice soft but steady. "I could have helped you." Ji-soo looked down, her silence returning, but it no longer felt like a wall. It felt like the quiet before a storm. Hyun-jae took a step closer, his hand brushing against hers. "We'll deal with this, together." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. And for the first time, she didn't pull away. The mansion seemed quieter than ever, though it was anything but peaceful. Park Hyun-jae sat in his study, staring at the empty glass of whiskey on his desk, its amber remnants glinting faintly in the dim light. Ji-soo's confession echoed in his mind, a voice that had broken through weeks of silence. "I was a witness." Her words had torn through the carefully constructed walls of his life, unraveling the indifference he had clung to. Now, her truth was tangled with his, pulling him into a conflict far greater than he'd imagined. A sharp knock at the door startled him. "Come in," he said gruffly. Ji-soo entered, her movements hesitant but deliberate. She held a notebook in her hands, its edges worn and frayed, as though it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. Without a word, she placed it on the desk in front of him and stepped back. Hyun-jae glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. "What is this?" Ji-soo gestured toward the notebook, her hands moving with a fluidity that seemed to communicate volumes. Then, As if realizing that wasn't enough, she spoke again. "It's everything," she said softly. Her voice, still unfamiliar to him, carried a quiet strength. Hyun-jae opened the notebook, his eyes scanning the handwritten pages. Inside were detailed accounts of what Ji-soo had seen, dates, names, locations, all tied to Yoo Min-seok and the web of corruption he had spun. "This," Hyun-jae said, his voice trailing off. He looked up at her, the weight of the information sinking in. "This could ruin him." Ji-soo nodded. "But it could also ruin me. If he finds out I've kept this, He won't." Hyun-jae interrupted firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. "I won't let that happen." The decision was made that night. Hyun-jae would confront Yoo Min-seok, using the notebook as leverage to end the blackmail and protect Ji-soo. But the tension between them remained palpable, an undercurrent of emotions left unspoken. As they prepared for the confrontation, Ji-soo lingered in the living room, her gaze fixed on the window. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within her. Hyun-jae approached her, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. "You don't have to come with me tomorrow," he said, his tone uncharacteristically gentle. Ji-soo turned to face him, her expression resolute. "I need to." Her voice was steady, but her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Hyun-jae studied her for a moment, his eyes softening. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for," he admitted. Ji-soo's lips curved into a faint smile, a flicker of warmth in the midst of the chaos. The next evening, they arrived at a private lounge where Yoo Min-seok had agreed to meet. The atmosphere was stifling, the air heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and the low hum of murmured conversations. Min-seok greeted them with a smirk, his confidence radiating as he lounged in a leather armchair. "Ah, Park Hyun-jae, and the lovely Ji-soo. What a pleasure." "Spare me," Hyun-jae snapped, his tone ice cold as he dropped the notebook onto the table between them. "We both know why we're here." Min-seok's eyes flicked to the notebook, his expression faltering for the briefest moment before he recovered. "Interesting. And what do you plan to do with this?" "That depends on you," Hyun-jae said, his voice sharp as steel. "You'll leave Ji-soo alone. No more blackmail, no more threats. Or this goes public." Min-seok laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the small room. "You think this scares me? You're underestimating how far I'm willing to go." Ji-soo stepped forward then, her eyes blazing with a fire Hyun-jae hadn't seen before. "And you're underestimating me," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Min-seok blinked, visibly startled. For a moment he said nothing, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Then his smirk returned, but it was less certain now, his confidence beginning to crack. The meeting ended without violence, but the tension lingered as Hyun-jae and Ji-soo returned to the mansion. They had struck a deal, a fragile truce that felt more like a ticking time bomb than a resolution. As they stepped inside, Ji-soo paused in the foyer, her shoulders sagging as though the weight of the confrontation had finally caught up to her. Hyun-jae hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. "You did well," he said quietly. Ji-soo turned to him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Thank you," she whispered. For a moment, the distance between them seemed to dissolve. Hyun-jae found himself drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain, his hand lingering on her shoulder as the tension shifted into something softer, more intimate. But before either of them could speak, Ji-soo stepped back, her composure returning. She nodded once, then turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving Hyun-jae alone in the quiet once more. The calm of the next morning was deceptive, like the stillness before a storm. Park Hyun-jae sat in his study, his fingers tracing the edge of the notebook Ji-soo had handed him. The weight of the coming confrontation loomed over him, but it wasn't fear that coursed through him. It was resolve. Ji-soo appeared at the doorway, her presence quiet yet commanding. She wore a simple blouse and dark trousers, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. There was no fear in her expression, only determination. "We're ready," Hyun-jae said, his voice steady as he rose to meet her. Ji-soo nodded, her eyes meeting his with silent understanding. For all the tension that had existed between them, they were finally standing on the same side, united against a common enemy. The meeting was set at one of HJ Group's boardrooms, an imposing space with high ceilings and walls lined with sleek panels of polished wood. The long conference table stretched like a battlefield, its surface gleaming under the cold fluorescent lights. Hyun-jae and Ji-soo entered together, their footsteps echoing in the otherwise empty room. Moments later, Yoo Min-seok arrived, flanked by two associates whose stern expressions hinted at their roles as muscle rather than minds. Min-seok's usual smirk was in place, but there was a flicker of unease in his eyes as he took in the scene. "Such a formal setting," Min-seok remarked, his voice dripping with false charm. "What's the occasion, Hyun-jae?" Hyun-jae ignored the bait, gesturing to the seat opposite him. "Let's cut the theatrics, Min-seok. You know why you're here." Min-seok sat, leaning back with exaggerated ease. His gaze shifted to Ji-soo, who stood beside Hyun-jae with her chin held high. "And Ji-soo, always in the middle of things, aren't you?" Hyun-jae's jaw tightened, but Ji-soo didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small voice recorder, setting it on the table between them. "This ends now," Hyun-jae said, his voice cold and commanding. "The notebook, the recordings, every piece of evidence we've gathered, it's all here. You're finished, Min-seok." Min-seok's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "You think you can scare me with this little show?" he scoffed. "You don't know the half of what I'm capable of." Ji-soo stepped forward then, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "And you don't know the half of what I've been through because of you." The room went silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Min-seok's gaze flicked to her, and for the first time, his confidence seemed to waver. "Ji-soo," he began, his tone suddenly placating. "Let's not make this personal. You know as well as I do that this can all go away." "No," she interrupted, her voice firm. "This doesn't go away, not anymore." Hyun-jae watched her with a mixture of pride and admiration. She was no longer the silent figure who had entered his life under the guise of submission. She was fierce, unyielding, and utterly unstoppable. The confrontation escalated, voices rising as Min-seok's attempts to intimidate them were met with unwavering defiance. At one point, his associates moved toward Ji-soo, but Hyun-jae stepped between them, his eyes blazing with a warning. "Touch her and I'll make sure you regret it," he growled, his tone leaving no room for argument. Min-seok raised a hand, signaling his men to stand down. "Fine," he said, his smirk returning, though it no longer reached his eyes. "You win this round, Hyun-jae, but don't think this is over." "It is over," Hyun-jae said, his voice like steel. "Walk away, Min-seok, before I make sure you have nowhere to walk to." Min-seok glared at him, but he didn't argue. With a sharp nod to his associates, he turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. The boardroom was quiet once more, the tension lingering like smoke after a fire. Ji-soo exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. "It's done," Hyun-jae said, his voice softer now. Ji-soo looked at him, her eyes shimmering with a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "You did this. You stood up to him." A small smile tugged at her lips, and for a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift. Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was noticeably lighter. Ji-soo sat by the fireplace, her legs tucked beneath her as she sipped a cup of tea. Hyun-jae joined her, his usual stoic expression softened by the glow of the firelight. "You never stop surprising me," he admitted, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. Ji-soo glanced at him, her smile faint but genuine. "You're not as cold as you pretend to be," she said softly. Hyun-jae chuckled, shaking his head. "Don't get used to it." They sat in companionable silence, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. For the first time, it felt as though the mansion wasn't just a house. It was a home. The days that followed the confrontation with Yoo Min-seok were marked by a strange calm, as though the storm that had consumed their lives had finally passed. Ji-soo moved through the mansion with a lighter step, her guarded expression softening as the weight of secrecy lifted from her shoulders. Park Hyun-jae watched her from his study window one morning as she watered the plants in the garden. The sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating her figure. She no longer seemed like a shadow haunting the edges of his life, but rather a part of it, steady and unshakable. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Ji-soo entered, her hair loose around her shoulders, giving her a gentler appearance. She held a small envelope in her hand and extended it toward him. "What's this?" he asked, taking the envelope. Ji-soo's eyes sparkled with something between mischief and hesitation. "Open it," she said, her voice still unfamiliar to his ears but filled with growing confidence. Hyun-jae carefully opened the envelope, pulling out a simple, hand-drawn card. On it was a sketch of his mansion, complete with the large glass windows and perfectly manicured garden. Beneath it, in elegant handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay." Hyun-jae stared at the card, his chest tightening. "You drew this?" Ji-soo nodded, her cheeks tinting with a faint blush. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "But you don't need to thank me, Ji-soo. If anything, I should be thanking you." She tilted her head, curiosity evident in her expression. "You changed everything," Hyun-jae admitted, setting the card on his desk. "You made this place feel less empty, less cold." Ji-soo's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing, her eyes locking with his. That evening, Hyun-jae made an unexpected decision. He asked Ji-soo to join him for dinner in the main dining room, an invitation that felt more personal than formal. The table was set with an understated elegance, candles flickering softly, the scent of freshly prepared dishes filling the air. Ji-soo wore a simple dress, her hair pinned loosely, and Hyun-jae found himself staring longer than he intended. As they ate, their conversation flowed more naturally than it ever had. Ji-soo spoke more now, her voice soft but steady, and Hyun-jae listened intently. "I've spent so long being afraid," Ji-soo admitted, her eyes focused on the flickering candlelight. "Afraid of what might happen if I spoke, if I let people in. But with you, I don't feel that fear anymore." Hyun-jae's throat tightened at her words. He reached across the table, his hand brushing against hers. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, Ji-soo. Not with me." In the days that followed, their relationship shifted, the lines of their once transactional marriage blurring into something more profound. Hyun-jae found himself drawn to Ji-soo's quiet strength, and the warmth that had always been hidden beneath her reserved exterior. Ji-soo, in turn, saw sides of Hyun-jae he rarely showed to anyone. His dry humor, his fierce loyalty, and the vulnerability he tried so hard to mask. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Hyun-jae stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "This started as a mistake," he said, his voice low but steady. "A bet, a game. But now it's the best decision I've ever made." Ji-soo's breath hitched, her heart pounding as she met his gaze. The sincerity in his eyes left no room for doubt. "I don't want this to end after a month," Hyun-jae continued, his hand brushing against hers. "I don't want you to leave." Ji-soo's lips curved into a soft smile, and for the first time, she let herself speak without hesitation. "I don't want to leave either. The mansion, once a cold, lifeless place, now thrummed with warmth and life. The months that followed were a testament to the strength of their bond, forged in silence but solidified through trust and love. Yoo Min-seok faded into obscurity, his schemes dismantled, and his influence shattered. Hyun-jae and Ji-soo moved forward, building a life that was theirs alone, unburdened by the shadows of the past. On a quiet evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the garden in hues of gold and orange, Hyun-jae and Ji-soo sat together on the veranda. "Do you think we'll ever forget how this started?" Ji-soo asked, her voice light with a hint of humor. Hyun-jae chuckled, pulling her closer. "I hope not. It's a reminder that sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected places." Ji-soo smiled, resting her head on his shoulder as the last rays of sunlight faded into the night. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right.